The field was empty, not cleared, not rested. Empty the way land goes empty when a man has had to carry everything out of it by hand and walk away before the first snow. The neighbors had watched him leave in September. They had seen the wagon. They had not said much. By mid-October, he was back. Not with lumber, not with a crew, not with the kind of materials a man brings when he is building something he expects others to admire. He came back with a truck bed stacked with curved panels of corrugated metal, military surplus, the kind of thing you could find at a government auction for almost nothing if you were willing to haul it yourself, and if you had no pride left about what your shelter was supposed to look like. He had $10, maybe a little less, depending on how you counted the coins. He spent most of it on those panels. What he built over the next several days was not a cabin. It was not a barn. It had no porch, no square corners, no windows facing south the way a sensible man would have planned. It was a half-cylinder pressed against the frozen ground, low and curved and ugly in the way that only useful things can be ugly. A woman from the nearest farm road slowed her wagon to look. She did not stop. She told her husband that evening that the man out on the ridge was building something that looked like a cattle culvert turned on its side. Her husband said that was probably the kindest way to describe it. The first hard freeze came 12 days after he drove in the last anchor stake. He was inside when it hit. By morning, when the temperature had dropped to somewhere near 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was working through every gap it could find in the structures along that valley, a thin line of smoke was rising from the south end of that curved metal shell on the ridge. Quiet, steady, unhurried. The kind of smoke that means a fire that has not been touched in several hours because the man feeding it has been asleep. Nobody understood that yet. Not that morning. Not for a while. But the smoke kept rising all winter. If you have ever had to choose between a bad shelter and no shelter, you already know what this story is really about. Stay with it. His name was Everett Cale. He was 37 years old, which felt older than it sounds when you have spent the last 4 of those years fighting a piece of land that did not want to cooperate. He had come out to that stretch of high prairie in the early part of the decade, the way a lot of men did, with a wife, a second-hand plow, and a belief that hard work was its own kind of capital. For a while, that belief held. The first 2 seasons were difficult, but not discouraging. The 3rd season was dry. The 4th was worse. By the time August of the 4th year arrived, the wheat that should have carried them through winter had come up thin and pale and wrong, and the bank that held the note on the property had already sent a man out once to look at the fields and make careful notes in a ledger that Everett was not allowed to read. His wife, Ruth, had a sister in Missouri. She had gone there with their daughter in late summer, not permanently, she said, just until things settled. She had taken the child's cradle, which Everett understood to mean something that neither of them said out loud. The bank took the deed in September. They were not unkind about it. They gave him time to gather what he could move, and left him the use of the truck for 2 days, because the man at the bank had grown up on a farm himself, and still remembered what it meant to carry a life out of a place in pieces. What Everett had left after September was a truck. A small wood stove that had been too heavy and too awkward to fit cleanly into any of the loads he had already moved. 2 wool blankets, a canvas tarp, a good axe, a box of tools, and a little under $10 in coins and small bills folded into the front pocket of his coat. He also had a name written on a piece of paper. A man at the county seat had mentioned, the week before, that the government was disposing of surplus Quonset hut components at an auction site about 40 miles east. Steel panels, anchor hardware, end wall framing. Some of it was incomplete. None of it was pretty, but the panels themselves were going for almost nothing because most of the men who showed up to those auctions were looking for equipment, not shelter, and a stack of curved, corrugated steel was not useful to anyone who had not already decided what they intended to do with it. Everett had driven out there on a Thursday and stood in the mud looking at the pile for a long time before raising his hand. He did not know exactly what he was going to build. He knew that he needed to be inside something before the real cold came, that he still had legal access to a parcel of land on the ridge above his former property, a small piece that had been left out of the banknote because it was rocky and north-facing, and considered worthless for farming, and that corrugated steel, whatever its faults, did not rot, did not warp, and was not afraid of snow. Beyond that, he was reasoning as he went. That was not the plan most men would have chosen, but most men still had other options. The panels arrived in the truck bed in 2 loads, and Everett spent the better part of 3 days on the ridge fitting them together the way the military instructions described, using a carbon copy of an assembly guide that the auction clerk had included in the lot, apparently as a courtesy, though several pages were water-damaged, and one diagram was missing entirely. The structure that emerged was roughly 16 feet wide and 30 feet long, its roof a continuous arch rising to about 8 feet at the center. There were no interior walls. There was no insulation. The end walls were framed with salvaged 2x4s and covered with a combination of plywood scraps and the canvas tarp, which Everett had cut and nailed in sections to fill the gaps the plywood could not reach. From the outside, it looked temporary. It looked like something you would use to store seed or park equipment through a wet season, and then dismantle when you needed the panels for something else. From the inside, it looked like a metal tunnel. Everett set the small wood stove near the south end, ran the flue pipe through a sheet metal collar he had fashioned from a cut panel, and spent one afternoon gathering and splitting deadfall from the tree line about a 1/4 mile down slope. He stacked the wood inside along the north end wall, which gave him roughly 2 cords to start, and left room along the east wall for his bedroll, the toolbox, and a small table made from a door blank he had salvaged from the former farmhouse before the bank took possession. A man named Herschel Pratt, who ran cattle on the land bordering the ridge to the west, rode up on the 2nd day of construction and sat on his horse at the edge of the cleared area for a while, without saying anything. Everett kept working. Eventually, Herschel said, "You planning to winter in that thing?" Everett said he was. Herschel looked at the curved metal panels, at the tarp sections tacked across the south end wall, at the stovepipe emerging from the roof at a slight angle because the collar had not seated perfectly flat. He said, "Steel conducts heat straight out. You know that." Everett said he knew it. Herschel nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has made his point, and considers the conversation complete. He turned his horse and rode back toward the fence line without another word. He was not wrong. Steel does conduct heat. The walls of an uninsulated metal structure bleed warmth the way a wet shirt bleeds body heat, constantly and in all directions. On a calm day in October, the temperature inside the hut was only a few degrees warmer than outside. Light the stove, and you could feel the difference within minutes. Let the stove go cold, and you could feel that difference disappear almost as fast. Everett knew this. What he did not yet know was what to do about it, or whether there was anything to do, or whether he had spent his last $10 on a problem with no solution that a man in his position could afford. That question would not wait much longer for an answer. The temperature fell to 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the first night that Everett slept inside the completed structure. He woke at some point before 3 in the morning, not from cold exactly, but from a kind of discomfort that sits just below consciousness and eventually forces its way through. The stove had burned down to coals. He had not planned to tend it through the night because he had been tired and had underestimated how fast the structure would lose heat once the fire dropped. He added wood and lay back down and pulled both blankets over himself and watched the stove begin to work again, its light throwing orange shapes across the curved ceiling. The ceiling was sweating. Not water, exactly. Condensation. Fine droplets collecting on the inner surface of the corrugated steel, where the warmer air from the stove was meeting the cold metal and losing its moisture. By the time the stove had been going for 30 minutes, there were thin lines of water running down the interior curve of the panels, finding the low points, dripping. One drip landed on his blanket. He moved the blanket. Another found the edge of the toolbox. He moved the toolbox. By morning, the inside of the hut smelled like cold iron and damp canvas, and Everett's back ached from the bedroll on the ground, and the stove had burned through more wood than he had budgeted for a single night. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee and looked at the problem the way a man looks at something he needs to understand before he can fix it. The condensation was not a small inconvenience. Left unchecked, it would soak his bedding, rust the toolbox, rot any wood that stayed in contact with the floor, and make the air inside feel colder than the temperature actually was. Damp air steals heat from a body faster than dry air at the same temperature. He had experienced that outdoors enough times to know it was true. He needed the walls to stop being cold. Or he needed the air to stop reaching the walls. He was not sure those were the same problem. He stepped outside and stood in the early light, looking at the structure from the east end, his coffee going cold in his hand. The panels curved from the ground on one side, up and over, and back to the ground on the other. The curve was unbroken, which meant there was no joint at the roofline where cold air could find a seam. The snow that had dusted the ridge overnight had not accumulated on the roof the way it accumulated on the flat-roofed equipment shed he could see down in the valley below. It had slid off during the night, leaving the roof bare. That was something. He was not sure yet what to do with it, but it was something. He went back inside, set the coffee down, and began thinking about what he had on hand. He did not solve the condensation problem that morning. He started solving it, which is a different thing. What Everett had inside the hut, besides the stove and the bedroll and the tools, was a quantity of loose hay he had brought up from the bottom field before it was seized, roughly a dozen burlap feed sacks, 2 partial rolls of tar paper left over from a roofing job he had done for a neighbor the previous spring, and the canvas tarp sections he had already nailed across the south end wall. None of these materials was insulation in any designed sense. But Everett had grown up in a drafty farmhouse in eastern Kansas and had spent enough winters watching his mother stuff rags into window gaps and nail feed sacks over doorways to understand the basic principle. Still air doesn't move heat the way moving air does. If you trap a layer of air between 2 surfaces, that trapped air becomes a barrier. It is not a perfect barrier, but it slows things down. He spent 2 days building what he later described in a letter to his wife, simply as a lining. He cut the tar paper into panels and tacked it to the interior surface of the corrugated steel, working from the ground up on both sides, leaving a gap of about 2 inches between the tar paper and the metal. Into that gap, where he could reach it, he pushed loose hay, tamping it lightly, not packing it tight enough to compress out the air, but firmly enough to keep it from settling into clumps over time. Where the hay was hard to place, he used folded burlap sacks. At the very peak of the arch, where he could not reach easily, he left the gap empty and covered it with a second layer of tar paper tacked directly over the first. The floor was a separate problem. The ground drew cold upward through the bare earth, the way cold always moves, toward any warmth it can find. And there was no practical way for Everett to insulate a dirt floor with what he had. He laid the remaining hay in a thick bed across the sleeping area, covered it with the canvas tarp sections pinned flat, and placed the bedroll on top of that. Herschel Pratt came by again on the second day of this work, this time on foot, which meant he had come deliberately rather than passing through. He stood at the open south end and watched Everett tack tar paper from a short ladder he had built from 3 scrap boards nailed between 2 uprights. Herschel said, "That tar paper's going to trap moisture between itself and the metal." Everett said, "It might." Herschel said, "Moisture in the wall cavity will rust those panels through inside of 5 years." Everett said, "I need to get through this winter first." Herschel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough," and walked back down the ridge. He was right about the rust. Over a long enough period, moisture trapped against steel does corrode it. But Everett was not building for 20 years. He was building for 1 winter with what he had, and 1 winter at a time was all the planning his situation allowed. The first real test came sooner than he expected. 4 nights after he finished the lining, the temperature outside fell to 9 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 3 days. The condensation on the interior steel panels did not disappear with the new lining. It moved. Instead of forming on the inner face of the corrugated metal, which was now covered by tar paper, it began forming on the inner face of the tar paper itself, which was the new coldest surface the warm interior air could reach. The dripping stopped, which was progress, but the tar paper surface along the lower sides of the arch was damp to the touch each morning, and the air inside the hut, despite the stove running steadily, carried a heaviness that Everett associated with a closed cellar in late spring, the kind of air that does not so much feel cold as feel used up. He woke on the second morning of the cold snap with a headache, and lay still for a while, listening to the wind work against the outside of the panels. The sound was different from wind in a wood-framed structure. Wood absorbs some of the sound, softens it. Corrugated steel transmits it cleanly, a low drum-like pressure that rises and falls with each gust. He noticed something during one of the stronger gusts. There was a place at the north end wall, near the top, where the tar paper did not quite meet the end framing, where a very faint current of outside air was moving inward. Cold, dry, cutting. He had considered that a flaw, a gap to be sealed. He had planned to fix it once he had time. That morning, watching the condensation on the tar paper and feeling the heaviness of the air, he did not seal it. He made it slightly larger. Not a hole, a deliberate gap, about the width of 2 fingers, running along the top edge of the north end wall where it met the arch. He cut a corresponding gap at the top of the south end wall, near the stovepipe collar. Then he waited. The logic was simple, though it had taken him 2 nights of bad sleep to arrive at it. The moisture in the air came from one source: him. His breathing, the slight steam from the stove's cooking surface, the damp from his clothes drying near the heat. That moisture had nowhere to go in a sealed structure. It accumulated until every cold surface showed it. But if cold, dry air could enter slowly at one end, and warm, moist air could escape slowly at the other, pushed by the slight pressure difference the stove's heat created, the moisture would leave before it could settle. It would not leave fast. It would leave just fast enough. By the morning of the 3rd day, the tar paper surface was drier. Not dry, but drier, and the air inside had lost the cellar heaviness he had been waking up to. The gaps cost him some heat. He knew that. Every cubic foot of cold air entering at the north end had to be warmed by the stove before it could do anyone any good. But damp cold and dry cold are not the same thing to live inside, and Everett had made his choice between them. The moisture problem was not fully solved. What it was managed. There is a difference on the frontier between solving a problem and learning to live alongside it without being destroyed by it. The next problem was already forming, out on the horizon, in the shape of a weather system moving down from the northwest. The real winter had not yet introduced itself. The storm system that moved in during the second week of November was not the worst of the winter. It was the one that taught him the most. It came from the northwest, the way serious weather always did on that stretch of prairie. Without much ceremony, a darkening along the ridge line in the late afternoon, and then wind that shifted from nuisance to intent within the hour. By nightfall, the snow was horizontal. By midnight, there was no ridge line visible, no tree line, no reference point of any kind. The world outside the hut had reduced itself to a sound, which was the sound of a great deal of cold air moving very fast across a flat surface, and to a pressure, which was what that air became when the ridge slowed it and forced it to reckon with whatever was sitting in its path. Everett lay awake and listened to the hut. In a wood-framed structure, wind finds purchase. It finds the corners, the eave joints, the places where two flat planes meet and create a seam. It works those seams. It makes the building speak, creak, shudder. If the structure is not well built, it begins to breathe in a way that has nothing to do with any ventilation the builder intended. The Quonset hut had no corners. The wind reached the curved surface and moved around it the way water moves around a stone in a stream, pressing and then releasing, following the arc, finding no flat plane to push against, no corner to concentrate its force. The panels flexed slightly under the strongest gusts, a low resonance that Everett could feel more than hear, but the structure did not shudder, and it did not breathe. Snow accumulated at the base of the curve on the windward side, building into a drift that by morning reached nearly to the midpoint of the arch. He had not planned for that. He had not thought about it one way or the other. But when he went outside at first light and dug his way through the south end door to stand in the cleared space behind the structure, he understood what had happened. The drift was acting as additional insulation. Packed snow is not warm, but it is a great deal more resistant to wind than open air, and wind is the primary mechanism by which a structure like this one loses heat in cold weather. The drift on the north and west faces had not buried the hut. It had armored it. The lower third of the curved surface, which was the most exposed and the least insulated, was now backed by 3 to 4 feet of compacted snow that the wind itself had placed there. He had not engineered that. The shape of the structure had done it without his help. He stood in the cleared area on the south side for a while, looking at the snow-flanked curve of the roof in the early light, and thought about what it meant. A flat-roofed structure collects snow as a burden, weight pressing down on a surface that is not designed to shed it. A curved surface sheds the load along the arc, and where the snow does collect, it collects at the base, away from the critical structural zone, and becomes something useful. The roof was bare. Every other roof visible from the ridge was carrying 2 feet of snow. He went back inside and fed the stove, and thought about the fact that he had paid almost nothing for a piece of physics he had not known he was buying. Surviving a winter in a marginal shelter is partly a question of warmth. It is mostly a question of arithmetic. Everett understood this by mid-November, when he had been living in the hut for roughly 3 weeks and had burned through what he estimated to be just under half of his initial wood supply. That was a problem. He had gathered and split what he judged to be approximately 2 cords of deadfall, enough to last the winter if the winter was an average one, and if the stove ran efficiently, and if the insulation held, and if the ventilation gaps did not steal more heat than he had calculated. None of those conditions were guaranteed. He spent 2 days ranging farther along the tree line, cutting deadfall with the axe, dragging it up the slope in lengths, and splitting it on a block outside the south end of the hut. He stacked it against the curved exterior on the leeward side, where the overhang of the arch provided partial cover from snowfall, and where the wood was accessible without requiring him to dig. Stacking wood outside rather than inside was a choice with a cost. Wood stored indoors is dry, easily reached, and warm to the touch. Wood stored outdoors, even under a roof edge, is subject to whatever moisture settles before it can freeze, and cold wood gives less heat per unit burned because some of the stove's output goes toward driving the residual moisture out before combustion can fully occur. But Everett needed the interior space. The hut was 30 feet long and 16 feet wide, which sounds generous until you account for the stove, the wood he kept inside as a 3-day reserve, the toolbox, the table, the bedroll, the hay bedding, and the fact that the curved walls reduced usable floor space considerably compared to a rectangular structure of the same footprint. A man can stand fully upright only along the center line. On either side of that, the ceiling descends with the curve, and there is a zone along each wall where the space is useful only for storage. He had arranged that storage zone carefully. The toolbox against one wall. Provisions on a short shelf he had built from scrap boards, high enough to stay dry if the floor moisture crept up in a thaw. His coat, hat, and spare boots hung from nails driven into the end wall framing near the stove, where they could dry without being in the way. The hut was not comfortable. It was organized. There is a specific kind of discipline that comes from living in a small space during a long winter. A discipline of arrangement, of knowing where everything is, of not wasting movement, of keeping the floor clear, because a fall in deep cold with no one nearby is a different kind of problem than a fall in warmer months. Herschel Pratt came by again in the 3rd week of November, leading a horse carrying 2 bundled sections of firewood across its back. He left the wood at the base of the south end wall without ceremony, said that his wife had sent it, and that he had not argued with her about it, and walked the horse back down the ridge without waiting for a response beyond the nod Everett gave him. Everett watched him go. He did not call after him. He understood that some forms of help are only possible when neither party talks about them too long. The wood from Herschel's wife, whose name was Dora, extended his supply by what he estimated to be 8 or 9 days under current burning rates. It was not a small thing. In the arithmetic of a prairie winter, 8 days is not a rounding error. He put 3 pieces in the stove and went back to splitting. December came in cold and stayed that way. Not spectacular cold. Not record cold. The kind of steady, unrelenting cold that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but does make for real ones. The kind where the temperature at dawn sits between 10 and 18 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 weeks without interruption, where the ground is frozen to a depth that makes the soil ring like low iron when struck, and where the sky is the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon without a single day of sun to interrupt it. Everett settled into a routine. He rose before full light, added wood to the stove from the interior reserve, heated water for coffee, ate from his provisions, which were simple and carefully rationed. He spent the early part of the morning on tasks, checking the end wall framing for any movement, inspecting the tar paper lining for new wet spots, splitting wood from the exterior stack in whatever weather was happening, which he did quickly, and returned inside from before the cold could get into his hands past the point of function. In the afternoons, he read. He had 3 books: a history of the Upper Plains settlement period, which he found he could not read for long without feeling a complicated kind of recognition, a farm management manual from 1923, which was largely useless to a man without a farm, but which contained a chapter on cold storage construction that he had read 4 times, and a Bible, which had belonged to his father, and which he read in the evenings less for doctrine than for the familiar cadence of the language, which had a way of making the sound of wind against steel panels feel less absolute. He wrote letters to Ruth twice a week. He was not certain she received all of them. The roads into the valley were passable on most days, but not all, and the man who ran the post from the nearest town made no promises about schedule from December onward. Everett wrote the letters anyway. He described the hut in careful, practical terms, the lining, the ventilation gaps, the way snow had drifted against the north face. He did not describe the nights when the stove burned low, and the cold came down through the tar paper, and he lay awake, counting the hours until he could justify adding another log without compromising the morning supply. He told her the hut was working, because it was. Not easily. Not without cost. But the curve held the snow load without complaint. The lining held the heat longer than bare metal would have. The ventilation gaps kept the air dry enough to breathe without feeling like he was sleeping in a root cellar. And the stove, which was old and slightly warped but fundamentally sound, ran through the night on a single good-sized piece of hardwood if the wood was dry and the damper was set correctly. By mid-December, the interior temperature at dawn, with the stove banked overnight, held somewhere between 38 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit on most nights. The outside temperature at dawn during the same period averaged around 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That gap between 26 and 32 degrees of separation was not luxury, but it was the difference between waking stiff and waking functional, between managing and not managing. Dora Pratt sent a second bundle of wood in mid-December with a note that contained a recipe for a hot grain porridge that could be made in a single pot, and would, she wrote, keep a man warm from the inside better than most things. Everett made it the following morning and found she was right. He wrote to Ruth about the recipe. He wrote that he thought they might get the land back in spring, that he had spoken to a man at the county seat who knew something about the bank's situation, that he was not saying it as a certainty, but as a possibility worth naming. He sealed the letter and set it by the door and stacked 3 more pieces of hardwood near the stove for morning, and lay down on the hay bedding under both wool blankets and slept until the cold woke him again, which was not until nearly 4 in the morning, which was, by any measure he currently had access to, a good night. The storm that arrived in the second week of January was different in kind from the one in November. That one had been fast and loud and had taught him something useful. This one was quiet. It did not announce itself with shifting wind or a darkening ridgeline. It simply began snowing at around 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. Fine, dry snow driven by a wind that had dropped to almost nothing, and it continued snowing in exactly that way for 6 days. By the 3rd day, the drift on the north face of the hut had reached the roofline. By the 4th day, a secondary drift had built up on the west side as well, following a subtle shift in the wind's direction that Everett noticed only because the sound against the panels had changed slightly in pitch. By the 5th day, from the south end, the hut was nearly invisible from 50 yards. What showed above the snow was the curve of the uppermost panels and the stovepipe, still putting out its thin line of smoke. On the 4th night, the stovepipe partially blocked. Not fully, but enough. Everett woke to a smell he recognized before he was fully conscious, the flat, faintly sweet odor of incomplete combustion, the early signal that the draft wasn't drawing cleanly. He was out of the bedroll and at the stove in less time than it takes to describe it, opened the damper fully, crouched to look at the stove's front draft vent, then straightened and looked at the ceiling where the pipe exited through the collar. The pipe was drawing. The stove was burning, but the flow was sluggish, and the air at ceiling level had a quality that made his eyes water slightly. He put on his coat and boots and went outside through the south end door, which he had to push against a drift that had crept around the corner of the end wall overnight. He climbed the snow face on the south side, which was firm enough to hold his weight, and reached the stovepipe where it emerged from the peak of the arch. The cap had partially collapsed under ice that had formed at the rim, narrowing the opening to roughly a third of its normal diameter. He cleared it with a stick he had left outside for exactly no specific reason, simply because he had not yet brought it in. Then he climbed back down and went inside and stood by the stove until the draft confirmed itself with a sound he could hear. A low, steady pull that meant the pipe was moving air the way it was supposed to move air. He did not sleep again that night. He sat at the table with a cup of water, the coffee supply having run out on the second day of the storm, and thought about the pipe cap, and about what would have happened if the blockage had been complete rather than partial, and about the fact that he had not built any redundancy into the ventilation system because he had not thought carefully enough about ice. He was not panicked by this. He was something more useful than panicked. He was precise. The following morning, during a brief pause in the snowfall, he modified the stovepipe cap using the tools in the box, adding a wider outer lip cut from a scrap of flat stock metal he had kept for no reason other than that he had not wanted to throw it away. The wider lip created a larger overhang, which meant ice forming at the rim would have to extend farther inward before it could meaningfully narrow the opening. It was a 20-minute repair. It took 4 days, and a near crisis to see the need for it. That is often how the important repairs work. The snow stopped on the 6th day. The sky cleared to a deep, sourceless blue that comes only in high winter after long storms, when the air has given up everything it was carrying. Everett dug out the south end door, walked to the high point of the ridge, and looked at the valley below. The Pratt place still had smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Several other farms showed smoke. One structure at the far end of the valley did not. He watched it for a long time without seeing any movement. He could not help from where he was. He noted it and turned back toward the hut. February arrived with a kind of reluctant brightness that the northern plains sometimes offer midwinter. Not warmth, not a thaw, but a change in the angle and quality of the light that tells a person who has been watching the sky carefully that the season has reached its far point, and is now, however slowly, beginning the long return. Everett noticed it on the morning of the 3rd day of the month, when the light through the gap at the top of the south end wall fell at a slightly different angle than it had in December and early January, landing further along the interior floor and holding a faint warmth that was not imaginary, not useful for heating, but real. He had learned to read the hut by then the way a sailor learns to read a vessel, not by its appearance, but by its behavior in different conditions. He knew which corner of the floor stayed driest. He knew the exact damper position that would hold a fire for 6 hours on green wood versus seasoned hardwood. He knew that the north drift, which had eventually reached the roofline and bridged partway across the top of the arch during the January storm, had actually reduced the sound of the wind inside the hut to almost nothing, because several feet of compacted snow absorb sound in a way that is difficult to appreciate until you have experienced the silence it creates. The silence was one of the things he had not expected. He had expected cold and isolation and difficulty. He had not expected that there would be mornings in the deep of a prairie winter, when the drift-armored hut was so quiet inside that he could hear the small sounds a wood stove makes when it settles into a long burn. A low tick, a faint breath from the damper, the occasional sharp crack of a knot in the wood catching. He had not expected that those sounds would come to feel like company. Ruth's letters, when they arrived, described Missouri in terms that made it sound warmer than it probably was. She wrote about her sister's kitchen, about the daughter adjusting well to the new school, about a neighbor who had offered her husband work come spring if they were still in the area. That phrase, "if they were still in the area," was not lost on Everett. He read it twice and set the letter on the table and sat with it for a while before writing back. He told her February was lighter than January. He told her the hut had held through the January storm without structural damage. He told her he was looking into the bank situation and that a man named Carroll at the county seat, who handled distressed agricultural notes, had written back to him with language that was not entirely without hope. He did not tell her about the stovepipe blockage, not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he had fixed it, and describing a near crisis after it is resolved tends to frighten people about what has already passed, which is a different kind of fear from the kind that helps anyone. By mid-February, his wood supply was lower than he wanted, but not critically so. The lining had held. The ventilation gaps were still functioning. The south drift had begun to retreat slightly on sunny afternoons, a thin line of meltwater finding the low point of the slope and refreezing each evening as a narrow glaze. Herschel Pratt came up the ridge on a clear afternoon in the third week of February, this time on horseback, and stopped a comfortable distance from the south end of the hut and looked at it for a moment before speaking. He said, "You made it through that January storm." Everett said he had. Herschel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the snow drifted against the north and west faces, at the bare arc of the roof panels, at the stovepipe with its modified cap. He said, "I thought that pipe cap was going to be a problem." Everett said it had been, briefly, and that he had fixed it. Herschel nodded. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he said, "My neighbor Aldous has a shed that blew apart in December. He is asking around about what to do for the rest of the winter." He paused. "I told him I knew a man who might have something worth looking at." Everett said he was welcome to send Aldous up. Herschel turned the horse and rode back down the ridge. That was the first time anyone had come to Everett for something other than to doubt him.